was considered like a pure policy debater. Like we lost occasions all the time and like only debated policy, and I just like really just hate the politics DA and think like debater would be better without it. So just understand that I'm coming from like that perspective. And I'm just going to give you kind of the basic arguments that I used to use to like, debate some of this stuff. And I would, after I get done with the theory, hopefully it'll turn into a little bit more of a discussion, because I've been like out of competitive debate for a long time, so I don't really know how this stuff is debated right now. And so if you guys could give me a little bit of aid in terms of like, if you do want to like, use this argument, like what the type of things people are going to respond with, and like if you need help answering those types of arguments, I can hopefully help you out, with some of that. So. Anyway, the main argument that I would use to argue for why politics disadvantages were no good was like what I sort of called the logical policymaking objection. And the reason why, this was just like something that I kind of came up with based on, I don't know if it's a great name for the argument, but it's the argument that you typically hear expressed as the intrinsicness argument. In other words, like you can do the plan as well as pass the Iran deal or whatever the politics dissent is of the time. Like I'll use the Iran deal, or like Iran doing good now is an example. And so the idea behind why you should do that, like obviously, like the reason why this debate, I think this has fallen out of favor recently, is because it is so clearly like intrinsic if you frame it like a permutation. But I never framed it like a permutation. The argument is that this is an illegitimate line of questioning because it disrupts the core question of the debate, which should be logical decision making. And the logical policy-making paradigm, I should explain this first, is based in the idea that the resolution offers us an opportunity to critically question a key aspect of public policy from a large range of various perspectives. And so in the context of this year, the resolution is to reduce surveillance, right? And in the I can't avoid talking about this. So back in like the 50s, 60s, 70s, academic debate was much more resolution focused. If you ever like looked at the resolutions for those years, they were very, very small, and yet kind of bigger in the sense that they were asking more fundamental kind of moral questions, like should we have international trade agreements, yes or no? And so the only act, of course, is like, yes, we should have international trade agreements. So from that perspective, it's a very limited topic, but the number of things that can come up in those debates, if you really explore those issues, from a variety of perspectives, is quite alarming. So we start moving to a more plan-focused model in the 1980s, like as digital, the revolution hits debate, and we have access to far more sources than we ever had before. No longer are debaters like limited by going to the library, reading the 3 or 4 newspapers that they had, and going through the books and whatever they can get through interlibrary loan, which is a relatively limited number of things and can only push you into a number of directions. Now debaters have access to like virtually every single publication on the planet instantaneously, access to archives of old journals, and all of a sudden people can get super specific on these types of things. And so there's a call for both there to be this sort of general push of the resolution, which is encapsulated in that first phrase of reduce surveillance, which is a relic of the resolution-focused debate era, and then some kind of qualifier now, which is a result of the plan-focused era on the type of plan mechanisms that you can do. And the reason like we're kind of caught in this transition is kind of because like no one like made this official. It kind of like happened organically, and so people started writing the resolutions to be sort of far more specific and to advocate for availability of individual plan mechanisms, because that's the way that people were debating now. People were sort of saying this is an example of the resolution, and that therefore justifies the whole resolution. And are you guys familiar with like the whole res debates? And like those debates were happening during this transition in the 80s, when people were saying, well, if you just prove that a little part of the resolution is good, have you met your resolutional burden to prove that the U.S. federal government should in fact reduce all surveillance? If you've just proven that they should reduce surveillance over like these 5 people, right? Does that make sense to everybody? So these days, we're like much more in the plan-focused debate. direction. Like these days you can like win your app, you can win that you should not surveil 5 people, and like very few people are going to make the argument, well, you have not made a good enough argument for like why all surveillance should be curtailed, so like you don't meet your resolution burden. No one makes that argument, right? So we're clearly like in this transition, and the reason why this is important is because the politics dissent is essentially a market inefficiency of this change. The politics dissent really didn't exist before the plan-focused debate because the questions that were being asked and answered were so much larger that they really subsumed the subject material of like any individual policy. For instance, when you had the resolution in 1955 or whatever, should the United States recognize communist China, if the act is just like, we should in fact recognize communist China, and the negative objection to that is, well, a whole bunch of people on Capitol Hill are going to be really upset about that. You know, that's like not going to be news to anybody in that debate, and quite frankly isn't a very relevant, you know, point to what we're trying to examine, which is like whether or not this should be our policy, whether or not this is a good idea, whether it is popular with a large number of people or not. And so the politics dissent emerges because debaters start to realize that like, well, now like these individual policy motions start to seem like individual pieces of legislation. And so they start to make the connection, well, what are the disadvantages to like policymaking and passing legislation? And they start taking the real world theories of political capital and start applying that to debate. And so now when you do a very plan-focused type of thing, whatever it is, like eliminate drones or whatever, it sounds a whole lot more logical to say, well, if you were to do that, then the Republicans in Congress would get really upset and then not pass some piece of legislation. And so the whole point of the logical policymaking argument is that when you make it about the political ramifications of the argument, i.e. the actor is going to be upset by it, you are no longer examining the moral core of the question. You're no longer examining the question of whether or not surveillance is actually good or bad. You're only looking at the real world consequences of whatever a change the status quo is, which is, by the way, about as far as I can tell most politics links go these days. It's like you did something that cost political capital, and our uniqueness card says that this bill is on the brink, right? Like these debates happen, or at least they used to, even at the very top level of college debate, and they could happen without anybody reading like a single, like, card about the actual issue, or even like really knowing what the bill did like the whole time, because it's all just done in like this super generic, you know, political capital language. And so it really divorces from the subject of debate. So to bring it all back around, the key objection is that saying that the actor of the plan, and this is, sorry, I gotta say this too, is that this really works, by the way, with saying that, you know, the resolutional actor is the United States federal government, right? And that you should, is that correct, by the way, still? Yeah. It says United States federal government in the resolution? Okay. So the resolution says United States federal government. That's what you should be forced to defend. And so this theory is obviously works against like agent counterclaims and stuff too in ways that we're probably not gonna have time to get into, but I can maybe come back and talk about another time. But the point of that is that it makes no sense from that perspective to evaluate the ethical or moral or even policy implications of a policy if your objection to it is that the body that is carrying out the act is going to react in an illogical way to itself, which is what the politics dissent is essentially saying. Because the actor of the politics dissent is the same as the plan. It is the United States federal government. And so when you take out all the issues, what the politics dissent is actually saying is that the government is going to decide to change its policy on domestic surveillance or whatever the resolutional issue is. And then to shoot themselves in the foot, they're going to turn around the next day and say, well, we're going to hold ourselves responsible for this, like in some kind of Catholic guilt style, by like not passing the Iran deal, despite the fact that we know that this is like the linchpin to global security. And so the point is that it is absolutely appropriate to discuss the reaction of the plan from any number of other actors. It's appropriate to discuss the reaction of the plan from the public, which is why this does not apply to elections dissents, first of all. It doesn't apply to any kind of international backlash dissent, like if another country would be upset about the plan, that's something that we should consider. But it is illogical to reject the decrease in surveillance if your only objection to it is that Congress is somehow constrained by some imaginary political capital theory to then shoot itself in the foot by then acting a certain way on legislation the next day. Couldn't the exact lawmakers that you're talking about, all 500 of them in Congress and the president, couldn't they just as easily, if they conclude that this is the correct policy action in both cases, say, yes, we should do the plan and we should pass the Iran deal? So that's the argument for like why it violates sort of the logical policymaking paradigm. And then I'll talk about why logical policymaking should come before all other forms of like education. But I think it's important to kind of stop here and ask if there are any questions about what I'm talking about, because I know that's a little weird. Does everyone kind of understand the basic argument? Okay. So logical policymaking should, and then at that point, if you win that argument, right, like if you understand why the dissent obviously is not a logical reason from this point of view to reject the plan, you're almost done, right? At that point, you've just got to win that this is this is the paradigm that we should be deciding theory debates on. This is the ultimate theory that you should be deciding debates on. Now they're going to say a couple of things to this. They're going to propose a couple of alternate theories for how you should view debate. And I'm debating on which order I want to do this in. I guess fairness is the most obvious one that people talk about. The negative always wants to talk about how negative ground is critical and how the politics dissent is crucial to negative ground. And oh my God, what would we do without the politics DA? Well, first of all, education should outweigh fairness in all instances. You can't really quantify fairness in any meaningful way. If something is so bad that it obstructs the debate in a way that it actually hinders it and prevents us from learning, then those instances do in fact disrupt the debate in a way that the judge or someone else can step in and say, like, this is an obvious violation and someone should be held responsible for it. But sitting around and trying to quantify what ground the negative should get by moving the line this direction or this direction, and what permutation ground the app can get, and spending 3 minutes of a speech arguing about that when we only have an hour and a half to talk about this issue in the first place in a debate it really kind of defeats the purpose. And that ultimately we should kind of like stop focusing on minor fairness levels and talk about education. Now, of course, they're going to come back and say, well, this is not really a minor issue, right? The politics dissent is like super crucial. And it teaches us so much about politics. It's all about politics education. We wouldn't know anything about politics if we didn't have the politics dissent. A couple of counter arguments. One, who said debate was about politics? No one. In fact, the resolution doesn't say anything about politics. And so there is an assumption these days that the political discussion is just inherently something that should be talked about because it's something that these days is in every debate. But in fact, I just want to emphasize the point that in between the 1950s and 1970s, no negative team ever won on the politics DA. And even 10 years ago, there were lots of teams who never ran it. It was a tool in policy teams' arsenal, but it was not the dominant tool. And so the idea that it is absolutely necessary to negative ground is not true from any kind of historical look at what's going on. Second is that it does not. Every politics dissent that I've ever heard argued in debate does not represent political reality in any sense of the word. And to argue that anybody is more educated at the end of a politics debate about either A, the way the political process works, or B, about the pros and cons, the actual policy pros and cons of the substance of the deal, I've never seen it happen. I've never come out of a politics debate being you know what? I know way more about the Farm Bill now than I did before, and I feel more confident talking about that with my friends. Or, you know what? I feel like I have a better understanding of the way things go through politics. I mean, there's two reasons for that. One is because we're not actually talking about real political theory. Every single argument is based on political capital, which is based on all kinds of flawed assumptions about the things that go into bills, which never get questioned, and you can make an argument that really we should be questioning the internal links, not the theory of it. But the point is that you should just call them out and say that this in no way teaches us about politics. and we should really like disassociate ourselves from that notion. And if you really just like want to be abreast of what is going on in the current congressional agenda, then you can read the news and be far more aware of what is going on than listening to like what is going on in politics debates. And so I think honestly the answer to all this political education stuff is you just have to come down on them. The idea that anyone is learning anything useful about politics in these debates. Yeah.
Like how would you answer the argument that it's like about the process of researching for politics that gets you the education about it?
So that process of researching can, first, I guess the core argument there is that, I'm not going to deny that, like, if you were to take the politics dissent out of debate, like, fewer people, unfortunately, would probably be, like, reading about politics. And so there you just have to come back with, like, yes, there may be a small trade-off with, like, research into politics, but ultimately logical decision-making is the most important thing. And here's another thing that I've got to explain on that for why it's a good argument for why this is a trump card, is that logical decision-making is going to be important for us no matter what we do. No matter what. Like, every single one of us has to make decisions every single day of our lives, and that's going to continue in the future no matter what career you decide to do. You always have to consider yourself as an agent in a variety of different circumstances and have the ability to say, I have this choice or I have this choice. These are the pros of that option and these are the cons of that option, and I have to make that decision. And this structure of debate, the one that promotes it, ultimately means that we could be talking about anything. The ultimate issue education of debate is far less important than the process of decision-making that it teaches you, which I think really gets back to your point, which is that the process is really the important thing. And the people who spend 4 years in debate sure know a little bit about the 4 topics that they spend time researching, but quite frankly, I don't remember a ton about like oceans policy, which was like my junior years. I mean, I know a little bit more about it than I would before, but the real value to my 10 years in debate had nothing to do with the hours of subject research that I was doing. It had everything to do with teaching me a process for thinking through any given issue and being able to do my own research, my own background, my own analysis of any issue, and to be able to make decisions in any context. Sure, politics debates may be of somewhat importance if you're going to be a politician, and like a lot of debaters like think they're going to be politicians or lawyers. When you look back, like, when I look back at like my old class, like very few of us actually turned out to be. And that's not a criticism of it. People are doing all kinds of really cool stuff. But the point is that the decision-making skills that I'm talking about, the ones that the politics dissent destroy through diverting the frame from logical policymaking, really interrupt that process, because we're again talking about something. It's the equivalent, let's do a real world example. I want to buy a car, right? And I don't have enough money to buy the whole car, right? And so from a logical decision-making paradigm, I've got a few choices, right? I could get a loan, right, to pay it over time. I could ask somebody for the money. I could ask Bill to pay for the car for me, right?
Monster truck.
Or a monster truck, right? I could ask him. And this is the equivalent, by the way, of like the asking the states to do it counterplan as opposed to the state's fiat counterplan. Or the asking Saudi Arabia to do something counterplan as opposed to fiating them doing something. That's the legitimate version of these counterplans. Because the agent specified by the resolution, is so important to remember, is the United States federal government. That's who you are, and that's the perspective that you have to think from. And so when I'm buying a car, I have no ability at all to ultimately affect what Bill does. I can influence him. Like the counterplan in this instance would be I could like give him some incentive, right? I could like give him something, or I could like threaten him or something like that, and then we'll have a solvency debate about the effectiveness of that mechanism. But if I just run a counterplan that says Bill is going to pay for the car, which is the equivalent of like what the state's counterplan is in all these debates, or whatever else agent counterplan it is, right? It totally destroys. Like, I can't make that decision in real life. That calculus is of no help to me now, because no matter what, I can't force him to do anything, and so it's probably not going to help me very much to be like, Bill should buy my car when it comes to buying my car. So that's the equivalent of the politics dissent, is basically what I'm arguing. Is you kind of avoiding that logical trek of process. We've talked about the policy education, and then issue education. That's really the only other thing they can say. I mean, it is like, well, it's really important to look at the way, what's important this year is national security or domestic surveillance or whatever the hell it is. And one really important aspect of that is to learn about the politics of doing any policy, right? Like the whole purpose of debate is sort of this is, I guess I should call this the think tank model of education. That what we should be doing in debate is taking an issue and doing a really deep dive over the course of the year and coming out of it with just a really sophisticated understanding of that policy field that we'll then be able to like influence other people with or whatever. And that's a perfectly noble form of debate. Just the fact is it doesn't work particularly well. Is that the purpose of debate really shouldn't be about always coming up with a real world solution. This is another kind of dissad, I would say, that you could argue against politics, is what I'm going to label the fetish of centrism. And this is the idea that everything in the world, every kind of problem in the world, you've got a radical interpretation on the left and a radical interpretation on the right about what the source of the problem is and how to fix it, how to go about approaching the problem, and the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. We don't really like the communists, just like we don't like the libertarians, because they're just too extreme for us. And what really appeals to us is just a right down the middle type of solution. And that is what the real world promotes. But what we have the opportunity to do in debate is to say, screw what is politically possible all the time. Let's start examining what could be possible if it were political. If something happened and all of a sudden we could have any policy that we wanted, what should it be? And isn't that a far more interesting discussion and a far more in-depth examination of whatever issue we're talking about than only allowing plans within a certain political spectrum that could possibly be considered in the real world? If every discussion you had of domestic surveillance had to sort of fit that litmus test of like being politically acceptable, or else you were going to like lose the politics dissent every time, then certain things right now that are going on that are truly terrible that should be talked about, that maybe aren't politically acceptable now, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be talking about it. Like shutting down Gitmo, for instance, is a perfect example of this. Obama in his first campaign was just like, this is outrageous, it's over, we can't do this anymore. If you let me president, I'm going to shut it down. That was a promise he made, and he's like a year and a half away from being out of office, and there are like still several hundred prisoners there. Now, why is that? Because, and now when the reporters question him on this, and they say, this was like one of 3 things that you made a promise about, why can't you do this? He says, well, look, I'm doing my best, and there's only so much power I have, and if the Congress doesn't let me do it, then ultimately I can't do it. And that shuts the debate. And that's the debate equivalent of the politics dissent. It's a censorship mechanism that says, like, if you actually propose a radical idea that seeks to question like the status quo methodology on anything, then you're just going to get hit with, well, that's not going to work in the real world. You're a hippie. We shouldn't discuss that. And debate is an academic space that is very unique in the sense that it is, and I was just actually talking about this randomly with a couple people before, as an adult, it's so rare that you walk into any discussion where you can have a truly unmediated dialogue, political dialogue, with somebody and actually like discuss like serious issues like income inequality and the nature of like, the capitalist system and things like that. Because in every forum, you've always got someone representing a larger thing, and everyone works for somebody, and you can only go so far outside of like what your page, whoever's paying you. Like, you can only say something so far to the right or left of where they are before you start pissing people off and threatening your own livelihood. Academic debate is like one of the few spaces where you can say anything, and the worst thing that can happen is the judge in the back of the room at the end of the round says, I disagree and I vote against you. And you move on to the next round and you get to start all over again. And that's a beautiful thing, and it shouldn't be corrupted by by limits on like only what is politically feasible at the time. In fact, quite frankly, I think we should be spending a lot more time debating what is currently politically unfeasible. Because there's plenty of discussion going on about like what is feasible, which is quite frankly not a lot. Which is another criticism I have of politics to say. Like, and this maybe is a good point to like start transitioning over to the whole like let's use logic and less evidence type of thing. Every single politics dissent ends in extinction, right? Pretty much, right? if our Congress doesn't do this, we're screwed. We're all gonna die, right? This Congress, the Senate has not passed a piece of original legislation since Dodd-Frank, which is almost 3 years ago. We shut the government down a couple of years ago. And like now, if there's like any problem at all, like even like the really serious ones, like when 54,000 immigrant children show up on the southern border, and like we need an overnight aid package to deal with a humanitarian crisis, what happens? The government goes into total stalemate. The point being is that the US Congress, as far as I'm concerned, hasn't done anything that could even like be construed to like dramatically impact anything in the short term in terms of geopolitics in a very long time. And so it's absurd that negatives in round after round after round get away with these internal link chains between whatever bill they're talking about in Congress and some extinction scenario. Like if it's true that like this bill is critical to stopping extinction, like we should all be running for wherever, because I mean, we're totally screwed. Like just start from that perspective, and it's just like, you know, nothing that the US Congress does is all that important. And so if you're talking about like a global economy impact, there have to be at least 3 internal links, more likely 12, between whatever that bill is and any possible effect on the economy. And just because they just read one internal link card doesn't mean that there aren't a ton of other internal links that they aren't just assuming, and that's like ultimately where they get away with it, is because they say, oh, well, you know, this bill is like intended to like reduce interest rates, and reducing interest rates is necessary to, you know, the business cycle, and the business cycle is necessary to the US economy, and the US economy is necessary to the world economy, and the world economy is necessary to preventing, you know, nuclear weapons from getting in the hands of the wrong people, and then a nuclear war would lead to extinction. You know, all of those things they have to win, and you know, their internal link card is usually about a sentence and a half long or something, and definitely does not address all of those things. And my problem is that affirmatives never go up. This needs to be happening in the cross-sects. It's just like, let's get real here. Like, you know, so what was the scenario run last weekend? Like Iran deal, what's the impact?
So Iran, like if Obama vetoes it, then it'll still be debated in Congress when Netanyahu arrives, which kills our credibility internationally, which kills Hedge, which causes extinction. Yeah. It was one of the better ones.
Right, yeah, that's great. So a signature on a piece of paper with a deal with Iran that like isn't even like, you know, the deal itself, which is both like an impact argument on the real level as well as the theoretical level. I mean, it is a deal, but it doesn't really do that much. It's just like, it's not like Iran has to like dramatically affect the program in any way. It's not like the United States has some brand new mechanism for averting it. So basically what I'm saying is that the deal is not like in and of itself a very huge item. I mean, like obviously like everything that gets debated in Congress gets made to be huge, but like in the grand scheme of things, whether this deal passes or not is like an irritant to the relationship between the United States and Iran. And it would be a major irritant in the relationship between the United States and Israel. And that's undeniable. And so there is a certain level of that link that is true. But then all of a sudden you start tacking on another link, which hopefully is also reduced to maybe, you know, a 30% level. And then you tack on another link. And so the point is that once you start pointing out the numbers of internal links in this chain and start reducing every single one to 50%, what happens when you continually multiply something by 50%? It gets smaller. And so the more, it's just a way of demonstrating that all these politics scenarios, you know, start off as something super small and always end up as something super big, which should just be a logical red flag that this is not very good for our logic skills. Because in any like true discussion of like the Iran bill, even in Congress, where these discussions have gotten like out of control vitriolic, any serious suggestion that failure to pass this would cause extinction or a complete collapse of US hegemony would not, you know, you'd be laughed out, you'd be carried out on a stretcher, you know, I mean, they wouldn't entertain that argument. And so that's just another demonstration of like, you know, you talk about political education, like this is not political education. This is the opposite of political education. This does not mirror what's going on the floor of Congress. It doesn't mirror how they make decisions. You know,